The next talk will be by Andrew Prag. He's a former, I think, policy expert on international cooperation in climate change. And now he started to have his own private business, but I'll let him introduce himself. Is that okay, Andrew?
So I'm Andrew Prag. I am currently, in fact, the Managing Director for Policy at what we call the We Mean Business Coalition, and I'm going to say more in a moment about what that is. But indeed, I have been in the international climate, energy, environment policy area for many years. I was previously in the OECD and the IEA there in Paris, and before that in the private sector working on policy as well. I was interested, you described me as a former expert. I don't know if it's possible to be a former expert, but I hope I still keep some expertise. So yes, I'm going to give a bit of a sort of complementing, I think, quite well Frank's excellent presentation just now, a view sort of zooming out on the international policy structures that exist and how we can make use of those to really drive policy action and more action and investment on the ground. But thank you for the great presentation so far, and actually very interesting debate. Was listening intently, and the points discussion on the demand side issues and the international development angles are so important. And I think as came across in Frank's presentation, we have we have most of the technologies. We pretty much know how to finance them, and all the rest is people in different ways, be it politicians, be it business executives, and be it, of course, citizens. So it's great to hear that there's this interdisciplinary nature to this conference, and the focus on the behavioral aspects is very important. So when I begin, let me just say a moment about what it is I work for now, this thing called the We Mean Business Coalition. So what we are, we're a non-profit working globally, working with the more progressive businesses who are trying to take more action on climate change to try to really galvanize increasing business action on climate, and in particular to get the message of businesses who are trying to do more into the ears of policymakers, to kind of overcome the negative lobbying that we hear a lot from incumbents, and really try to get a positive message and try to move governments to do more. So we're a coalition, in fact, of other business-related non-profit organizations. You can see the logos of the 7 founding partners on the screen there. And we now work with them, but also much more widely internationally, with more than 50 partners around the world, and really interacting directly in more than 10,000 businesses to try to make things move faster from the business side. I will just mention quickly, because it's relevant to what I'm going to say afterwards, the sort of theory of change that our coalition works on. And it's a term much loved in the NGO sector, for the theory of change, is this thing called the ambition loop. And what this says is quite an elegant concept, is that if businesses really choose to take the lead, for example, on energy transition, on action on climate change, if they go out there and show that to governments, they advocate actively and positively in front of governments, well, that actually helps to give those governments the confidence to improve their policies, to do more coherent, better regulation, without fear of business lobbying against them, and to understand that business really wants this change. And that new policy then drives more businesses to take action, who then come back and advocate, and that drives more policy, and you get this positive cycle of increasing ambition and action. And so that's what we're trying to achieve. In the real world, it's obviously more messy than that. But we still do see examples of this happening, and one from the transport sector on electric vehicles. So we see some of the big auto manufacturers took the lead and said, look, we will step forward, and of stating that we will cease to manufacture internal combustion engines and go fully electric by a certain date, say by 2030. Then they go to governments in the countries they operate in and say, look, we're doing this anyway. That then gives governments confidence to then bring forward their own mandates to put a ban for all production of internal combustion engines, which then makes others act, and so on. So we really see this happening in practice. I sort of start with a bit of context on climate change in the current moment, and I'll go this quite quickly because it overlaps a bit with Frank's presentation, but a slightly different perspective, I think. So very quickly, we all know this, but I always like to begin a presentation related to climate change with this, because it is the fundamentals of what we're trying to do. Climate change is unequivocal and human-induced, and there are many ways of representing this. I like this one from NOAA in the United States, where you just see the temperature anomaly over the last 140 years of land and ocean combined, and you just you can see the trend is just absolutely striking. And here we are at about 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is around 1 degree above the 20th century average, and of course climbing rapidly every year. as very clearly stated by the IPCC, is the limit to really avoid the worst impacts of climate change is 1.5, and we are rapidly approaching that level. What this means, of course, many visible and intensifying impacts of climate change, which we're already feeling now at 1 degree above 20th century average. This means this extreme weather events that are the most newsworthy and that we hear most about. Any particular moment, there's always something happening in the world, which is some freakish, strong weather events, but also very important, slow onset changes, the rising seas, melting glaciers, and those implications. And then, perhaps most frighteningly, the threat of climate system tipping points. And Andre referred to this in his introduction, these abrupt, irreversible changes that can happen. So they're really terrible economic and social impacts. Why is this happening? Well, again, as IPC and Frank mentioned, the emissions continue to rise. This is just some most recent data from my former colleagues at the IEA, where you see the historical perspective, but then you really see how that trend is continuing to rise, despite the big blip downwards that we saw from COVID-19 in 2020, and that at the time, of course, we were all very enthusiastic about building back better and green recovery, and what happened is the economic recovery happened strongly and fast, and with a lot of green investment, but still those emissions bounced back right to where they were and continue to rise in 2022, still the highest ever, and the indications for 2023 is that it's going to rise again, albeit by less. We do seem to be approaching a peak, but emissions are still rising, and it's so far from the kind of pathways that Frank was talking about where we need to get to. Why is this happening? Well, many reasons, and the land use, agriculture, forestry element is important, but at the heart of it is really the fossil fuels question. And I find this really striking. It just shows how stubborn fossil fuels are in the energy system. Again, data from IEA, and just see the difference from 1971 to 2019. The two blues and the light green is the three fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, and the percentage in the primary energy mix dropped from 87 to 81% only in that time. And most of that drop was actually nuclear. Because of course in that time the world really built out its nuclear energy, including here in France. And I should say, by the way, I'm in France myself, but in Haute-Savoie, just across the border from Geneva. So phasing out unabated fossil fuels is really at the heart of the problem, and I'll come back to that when I talk a bit about the international policy areas. Also, in terms of sort of conclude my climate context setting, there is some cause for optimism, and just this week, actually, the IEA put out their new update of their net zero roadmap, which is a fantastic piece of work. I really recommend you look at it if you haven't already. Just to pick out two charts from it that really show signs of how things are changing fast. So Frank already referred to the rapid growth in clean energy and falling costs, but here we see the latest kind of growth curves across 4 key technologies. And you really see this exponential growth starting to happen. And when you look at historical technological changes, be it washing machines or mobile phones or microwave ovens or whatever, when you hit this sort of growth curve, rate of growth, and things turn exponential, you're onto an unstoppable S-curve where you rapidly rolls out across the full park of technology. So that is itself very encouraging. And then this figure I found particularly heartening, actually. This looks at innovation and the state of innovation of needed technologies to achieve these kind of net zero emissions pathways, and compares the scenario that the IEA had 2 years ago when they first did their net zero pathway in 2021 and the one they just released this week. And the different colors show the different levels of maturity of the technologies we need to achieve those percentages of emissions reductions that we need. And what they said 2 years ago was that nearly 50% of the emissions reductions are still those technologies which are orange and yellow, so in the prototype and demonstration stage. Now, in only 2 years, they reassessed the situation, and that percentage has dropped to only 35, because the technology has been moving forward so fast and things have been moving into market and commercialization. So it's actually, I think, some of the best news I've heard on climate change for a long time in this particular chart. So I recommend you have a look at the rest of the report. Turning now to the kind of policy context, I said I would take a zoom out view on how the international policy structure impacts all our investment and behavioral decisions. Policy context, and this actually came up already in the very interesting discussion you were having just now, but the world is in this state of what some people call polycrisis, where we had COVID-19, we stumbled then into the war in Ukraine, we have these intensifying climate impacts, and it's all sort of overlapping, and you have to wonder what might be next, and it has this implication of making it very hard for policymakers to take sort of coherent and stable action. That said, the energy crisis that we've faced in the last year and a half, particularly here in Europe, I think it's safe to say now that it has had an effect to accelerate the clean energy transition through political support, through cost reductions in investment and so on, and just the absolute necessity of shifting away from natural gas. But that progress is still fragile, given the cost of living crisis we're still going through, given the inflation, rising cost of capital we've been talking about, and given the political polarizations we see. So policy still remains very important, which is kind of a key theme of my presentation, as you'll see. Despite that, we see most countries are still committed to their long-term climate targets and are sort of talking the talk about really needing to take this long-term action and to get to net zero globally by 2050 and so on. But we are seeing some backsliding on the near-term progress and policies that are needed. And just 10 days ago, my birth country, the UK, chose to actually roll back some policies and announced that literally on the day that the UN Secretary General was hosting his summit on climate ambition in New York. And you can imagine how that news fell internationally on that particular day. It's just one example. That said, when you look at the international policy context we're facing right now, a big surprise of the last year was the US Inflation Reduction Act. I think our friends in the US administration surprised pretty much everyone, including themselves, to manage to pass this enormous piece of legislation through the US Congress, which, despite its name, is essentially climate change policy. And despite, as well as driving enormous innovation and in investment in the US, it really recast the sort of international landscape of industrial policy in one go. And we can maybe talk a bit more about that later. The rest of the context, we have this ever-present threat of populism, I think it's fair to say, in many democratic countries. This notion that moderate central-placed governments who are really trying to take action and want to do more and want to go fast, they have to be careful because that progress could be wiped out in one go if they get pushed out of power at an election by a populist who then tries to roll back all the progress made. So that balance of keeping things moving while keeping the democracy with you is a very important part of the context. And then we have the visibly accelerating impact of climate change. Of course, as I mentioned, and that is, I like to say it's both scientifically, but also anecdotally. It's so present and evident now that all of us, I think, have our stories about something which made us think this is not right. And this is just one picture from my experience. On New Year's Day this year, I took my kids skiing in mountains near here in Savoie, and I'm sitting on the chairlift, and this was the view. And I thought, well, that's, what is this? It's an anecdotal example of something that's not right. This can kind of be distilled into what we might call some headwinds and tailwinds for climate policy internationally. Very quickly, we have this rapid growth of clean energy and technology, falling costs. We have this crisis that has accelerated action. We have, I think, importantly, increasing citizen awareness of climate change and support for that action. And that is really globally. We hear a lot about it in OECD countries, but there are surveys happening around the world in the global south as well, which shows this is actually, despite the hardship and the development priorities, people are aware of this. We've seen net zero target setting go mainstream, as Frank mentioned in his presentation. In most countries now around the world, and thousands of governments, regions, cities, companies, and so on, have these targets covering now 88% of emissions. And we have this, this major climate policy in the US that I mentioned, that's really driving investments there and internationally. Tailwinds, however, those were the tailwinds. The headwinds, what's acting against us, the inflation, cost of capital, material costs rising is very important. And this situation where we even hear about wind turbine manufacturers in Europe who, this should be their golden age given the growth in renewables, but they're struggling commercially because the steel is so expensive, because capital costs of running renewable energy projects are so important relative to the running costs, that a situation of rising interest rates makes it quite hard to finance projects, and that's important. We have this sort of fractious geopolitics, of course, around the situation with the war in Ukraine, and Russia's invasion, and the implications of that for collaboration. We have, as was mentioned in the debate just now, the concerns about energy security rising to the fore. And while those of us who are economists, analysts, can point out that a transition away from fossil fuels is probably the best way to address energy security, that doesn't stop politicians turning to the sort of easy, near option of developing fossil fuel projects for that reason. We have the cost of living crisis internationally, which may lead to weakening of policies, as I mentioned. And then we have an issue which I work a lot with now about what to do with the corporate sector. There's so much positive action happening by businesses now, but there is mistrust about what they're doing. There is threat of what we call greenwashing, with companies communicating more than what they're actually doing. But we now have this real and present issue of what we call green hushing, which is the fact that the legal and political situation has got so difficult in some countries, notably in the US, with this sort of anti-woke capitalism agenda and the anti-ESG agenda, that companies are actually shutting down what they're doing for fear of legal challenges, which has become a significant factor now. I just wanted to highlight one where I find very fascinating, very recent example of this sort of tailwinds and headwinds operating politically. I mentioned this IEA report that came out this week. It has one recommendation in it that's very clear, and it says that in the net zero emission scenario, demand for oil and gas declines fast enough that no new long lead time conventional oil and gas projects need to be approved for development. So that was on Tuesday this week. On Wednesday, this was the news from the UK, that UK regulators approved plans for the new Rosebank oil field, the largest untapped oil field in the United Kingdom waters, the very next day. And it's just, I think, a very striking example of how politics plays out in the short term. The UK is a country still with a net zero ambition for 2050, trying to push leadership internationally, and yet this massive hypocrisy comes through with these kind of decisions. What does this mean then for policymaking and influencing people's investment and behavioral decisions? I've worked a lot on the international scene, the sort of multilateral level of policy, and I think a lot about how that actually distills down into legislation, regulation in countries. So I thought it's useful to kind of map out how these things fit together and then conclude with a bit of where the current state is and what we can expect to happen internationally in the coming months. So we have these sort of different levels internationally of policy discussions, from the multilateral and then of course down to the domestic. I tried to sort of map them in terms of has primary relevance to climate change and what's kind of secondary relevance. So of course at the domestic level, we have the national legislation and regulation that drives the real investment decisions, the real changes at the local level. And then in some countries, the subnational legislation is very important as well, notably in the United States and other federal economies. And it's good to know that you're having a discussion with the cities later, because that's obviously an important level. And then at the most international level, we have the multilateral. So of course, the United Nations framework on climate change is the main multilateral process at the heart of it. But then we have these other international conventions of secondary relevance. And then I would say in between the two, on transport, the IMO and the ICAO, which are so important for driving action on these international elements of transport. But then we have the in-between, we have the kind of plurilateral grouping. So the G20, G7, very politically important economically, but also on climate change. We have sort of spin-offs from them, like this new climate club. We have the World Trade Organization, obviously not a climate body, but extremely important for how things happen internationally related to trade and investment. And then we have the regional groupings and policy situations. So the regional economic integration organizations, obviously the EU is a very special case of that, but there are others internationally, the African Union, the ASEAN group, others around the world, and less relevant to climate change, the regional trade agreements and investment treaties. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think it's just useful to think for a moment about the link between the multilateral level and the domestic policy changes. I won't talk through this for a long time, because I think we could talk for hours about whether the UNFCCC has had an impact, what that impact is. It's been the centerpiece of international climate discussion for 3 decades. Some argue that it's just a talk shop, and emissions are still rising despite 30 years of talks. My take is that it's played a huge and important and ongoing role in actually keeping governments to account, keeping things moving domestically, and having a big impact. And again, I won't talk through the various stages here. I just picked out what some of the key milestones are and the impact that's had on how things happened domestically. I think carbon pricing is perhaps one, that the Kyoto Protocol really brought that forward, institutionalized the carbon market, drove the development of carbon pricing in Europe. And now jump forward where we are now, so a situation where we have the bottom-up country-determined commitments under the Paris Agreement. And what the question is, how can that really help to drive action domestically, and how does that action feed back into getting more agreements internationally? I'm going to say a thing or two about that. But I would say what characterizes the international discussions right now is this deep mistrust between the North and the South, between essentially developed and developing countries over commitments on climate finance. The fact that the famous promise to mobilize $100 billion per year for developing countries for climate has only now materialized, even though it was promised before 2020. And this notion of CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibilities, about how we divide up responsibilities for climate change across countries, as sticky as it ever was, and really is why this process is challenging and moves forward slower than it would really need to. I think it's just important to touch on this question of how we might see impacts from the multilateral level actually making a difference on the ground domestically. I tried to map this out here in this notion of using the ambition loop concept that we use for businesses. I think it's actually relevant also in this kind of international domestic link. So, we have the Paris Agreement. It delivers these decisions at a high level, the so-called COP decisions on things like, ever improving the overall ambition, setting the rules and guidance for how countries operate, in particular for the transparency and making sure that others know what's happening, which is one of the key value adds of this international process, especially in such a difficult geopolitical context now. The global stocktake, which I'll come back to in a moment. And of course, we have these nationally determined contributions, this bottom-up process where countries set their own commitments in any form that they want, and that they then have to update them and make them more ambitious every 5 years. That's what's coming from the multilateral side. Domestically, of course, we have all of what's going on in countries. We have their net zero targets and strategies. We have, depending on the country, the style, the context, we have setting of carbon budgets, the use of explicit carbon pricing, the importance of different energy and infrastructure policies. And then increasingly the necessity, and this was something we worked on a lot at the OECD, I could talk about it for hours, but I won't, but the need for really aligning across the whole of government. It's not just climate policy, it's about economic policy, fiscal policy, tax credits as subsidies as much used in the US now, social, and then permitting, planning policy, making sure that things can get built when they need to be built, and so on. How do these two things link together? Well, this is where you get this notion of an ambition loop, is that countries are under pressure to improve their national determined contribution to make it more ambitious. That then makes them look domestically, well, what can we do? What are the options out there? In making new policy, they realize that actually the NDC can go even further and pushes other countries, and you get this kind of ambition loop. So I see this kind of link between the multilateral and the domestic. I don't want to take too much time, so just a quick word on the G20 and the G7. I had them in my map there, sort of in the middle. They don't have no legally binding status, but they've become increasingly important and have an important bearing on both domestic policies and the UNFCCC climate outcomes. They really vary year by year, depending on the policies of each and priorities of each presidency, because it moves every year amongst the groupings. In general, the G7 is the more coherent group on energy and climate change. These are all OECD countries. They tend to see more eye to eye on these issues, although not completely. Whereas the G20 is much more challenging, always has been, but especially since last year. Russia, of course, is still a member of the G20. The last two presidencies, Indonesia and India, have been quite welcoming to Russia, and this, of course, creates significant geopolitical issues before we even start talking about climate and energy in these groups. Just a quick insight on what's been happening this year from these groups. So the G7 was hosted by Japan, traditionally the least progressive of the G7 countries on these issues, but nevertheless, and despite the difficult context, they did, in their leaders' communique, reinforce commitments to climate change, to 1.5, to net zero. And very specifically, they did commit to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels in line with 1.5 degrees, which is an important win and was by no means guaranteed from the state of the G7 discussions. They also reiterated their commitment to end fossil fuel subsidies, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, I should say, already by 2025, which was the previous commitment and is becoming increasingly difficult to imagine how that will happen, given the subsidies have actually been increasing with the cost of living crisis. Nevertheless, that commitment was reiterated. The G20, which met just this month in India, very challenging context. All kudos to the Indian presidency. They did succeed in getting a leaders' declaration. Even that was not a given how difficult politics is. They notably committed to pursue and encourage efforts to triple renewable energy globally. And I'll come back to that because it's an important dimension on the international scene right now. They did not, however, have any language on fossil fuel phase out. And perhaps naturally, given the presidency in India, they had a strong emphasis on resilience and particularly supporting to global South countries. Let me just conclude with saying where next with this kind of international policy agenda. The next big thing on the calendar is the next COP meeting. So this is COP28. It's in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. There has been a vigorous debate all year about what is the role of a major oil and gas producer as host of these climate change negotiations. My personal view is that this is actually a positive thing, and that these discussions are multilateral. You have to have everyone at the table. Forcing was arguably one of the more progressive members of OPEC to be leading these negotiations is actually a positive element of getting them to the table and forcing the change that has to happen. What will happen at this COP? So we'll see the culmination of this first global stocktake I mentioned briefly earlier, which is part of the Paris Agreement process, where the world takes stock of how action has happened so far. Technical synthesis report has already come out and really is a strong call to action, including on this issue of fossil fuel phase out. But we still need to now see negotiation of a political decision at COP28, which is going to be a sticky and challenging process. Some of the outcomes we might see at COP, what we're really pushing for is to have some text on the commitment to phase out unabated fossil fuels, to really set the direction of travel, to have a sort of clarion call that this has to happen. That's a challenging negotiation, but it's still possible. We're seeing increasing momentum around, as I said, for the G20, this tripling of global renewable energy capacity by 2030, and at the same time doubling energy efficiency improvements. Looking ahead beyond this COP, we have COP29 next year, where there's the deadline to commit a new goal for North-South climate finance, which is a challenging discussion. And then the following year is when we get to the deadline for these new round of national commitments, national NDCs, which is really the next big landmark in terms of trying to get this ambition loop moving. A few conclusions. I would say, the energy transition is accelerating and approaching these technological tipping points, but we still need clear, coherent, stable policy to make the full transformation happen. Don't dismiss the international processes. I really think they play a crucial role in setting the framework and pushing countries to do more. And given how difficult the geopolitics is internationally, we really have to cherish this multilateralism while we have it. It's so important that countries are talking and being transparent with each other. Target setting alone is not enough. We need the policy to be trickling down at every level to show progress at sector level and across this kind of whole of government approach. We really need to be maintaining this public support for policy, so the just transition principles and really sensitive to cost of living has to be at the heart of it. Unfortunately, whatever we do now, significant climate impacts are already baked in, so we still need an ever greater focus on resilience and adaptation, though I didn't really talk about it today. And lastly, coming back to my current day job, we really need progressive businesses to be stepping up and advocating for what they're doing and pushing governments more and getting this kind of ambition loop going. So I just conclude with a sort of plug for this campaign we're running right now to get businesses to step up. It's called Fossil to Clean, and we're trying to get businesses to say themselves, we are going to phase out fossil fuels from our own operations and create a demand signal that will move governments on that point. So with that, I'll stop and very much look forward to some discussion.
Okay. There's room for one or two short questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the very nice presentation and for the beautiful pictures of the lack of sea. Just a quick question about what your constituents, the businesses you work with, tell you about what would be their priorities, what they see as the key obstacles for doing more in terms of mitigation. We know that for investment, the key issue is risk and limiting the risk. So is it, do they tell you that they need to have less risk on technologies, less risk on the regulations? Is it on the financing side? What are the priorities they see given the context that you have outlined? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question, and well spotted for the lac d'Annecy. Yeah, so I guess the answer is quite dependent on the sector and the geographical context of companies. But those big ones operating internationally, I think the thing they say to us most is that they need the consistent, clear policy signals. And it's not a new thing to say, but it remains the case that they are looking to make these big investments. They need to make the case to their board that this is a medium-term decision and not a short-term one, and therefore they have to have that backed up by the knowledge that they will be supported in this by governments by setting the incentive and the regulatory structure in the right way. And I think this is why the Inflation Reduction Act in the US has had such a quick and big impact on investment. And we see some studies showing tens of billions of dollars already mobilized for investment in US in production of clean energy supply chains and of deployments, remarkable impact. And it's also why we saw some very strong statements from some big businesses about the UK's rollback of policies 10 days ago. I was sitting with some people from major car manufacturers that day, and they was like, we can't believe this. We are making these risky business decisions, risky in the sense that has to convince all the shareholders and all the board to do it. And then the government kind of pulls the rug from us just as we're showing them that we really want to make these investments. And there were some quite strong statements about that from the likes of Volvo and Ford and others to say, we just need this more clarity and consistency of action, because that then helps with the cost of financing and the cost of capital, which after all is what is the bottom line business decision. So if I had to pick one, it's that. But there are of course others, and by sector and by geography, it's different.
Thank you. Maybe I add one more small question. You know the green paradox? The green paradox, the story is very simple. Those who have a lot of cheap oil and gas, if I see new technologies coming, the electric car, etc., maybe it's time to get rid of oil and gas now that we can still do it. So I was a little bit surprised of the interest of Doha and, let's say, Middle East in climate change policies. Do you have a clear explanation for that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's hard to know what's going on, to be honest. And with this very strong focus on the United Arab Emirates at the moment, with them hosting the climate negotiations, a lot of people are discussing this. I don't know what the real drivers and decision-making processes are, but what is clear is they do see, as we say, the writing on the wall. There is a desperate need for diversification in those economies. They see that sooner or later. The question is when, but sooner or later there will be a drop in global demand for oil and gas. At that point, if they have not diversified their economies, those regimes will not be tenable and have major social crisis in those countries. So the genuine desire to use the huge wealth that they have, the sovereign wealth funds, to invest in diversification of economies generally, and including on investing in clean energy is one aspect of it. That said, it's important not to be naive about this. Of course, they're in the game to keep the demand going as long as they can, and that is partly the big push. I didn't mention it in my talk, but there's this word unabated. So we talk about phasing out fossil fuels. The political language is phasing out unabated fossil fuels, and there's a lot in that word unabated. Part of it is how much can you do with carbon capture and storage, so to maintain fossil fuel supply chains but remove the emissions part. For obvious reasons, those countries are pushing those technologies because that would prolong the demand for their products longer than otherwise. Another element of it is that and this can sound a bit strange to someone who hasn't thought about it before, but they're pushing for their oil to be greener than others' oil. On life cycle assessment of the emissions right through from exploration, production, refining, delivery, someone like Saudi Arabia actually has a lower footprint than many other oil producing countries. So they're starting to differentiate themselves on that. Our oil is greener than yours. That is true, but it doesn't get you anywhere near, of course, the pathways that Frank was showing, and this very steep fall off in emissions that we need, and therefore steep fall off in demand for oil and gas that the IEA has been projecting. So in conclusion, it's of course very hard to know what's really driving the politics in those countries, but there is a strong and rational push for diversification. At the same time, they are clearly in the game to maintain demand for their products as long as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we thank you for your contribution. And I think we can move to the next speaker. Thank you. Thank you.